Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Mike Berry again, Executive Director for WASBO. Happy Wednesday. Delighted to have you join us for our quarterly transportation updates. This webinar is usually around 40-45 minutes. It is recorded, and delighted to have you join us. Often in these webinars that we do, the conversation and the information that's in the chat is super valuable. So please pay attention to that as well. Before we dive in, I just want to share a quick story. This morning, I was driving in to Madison from the Oconomowoc area, and I was on a two-lane highway, kind of a windy, curvy highway, and there was a school bus picking up kids ahead of me, like way ahead of me. And so this was like a 55-mile-an-hour street, by the way, their highway. So I'm coming around this curve, and this is a good news story. This is a rare, good news story. Um, the kids who were waiting to get picked up had to like literally cross the highway um, and to get onto the bus. So what I loved about it was the bus was right where it should be, lights flashing, stop sign out. The car that was in front of me, which was the key car that had to stop, was stopped a good 100 feet away from where these kids would cross. And on the other side of traffic, there was a car trailing the school bus. They too were stopped and allowed a lot of distance. And then lastly, the mom was right there watching like a hawk to make sure these kids got across safely. And then the kids, when they went scooting across the highway, their heads were on a swivel. They were looking left and right and left and right. And then finally, you could see the bus driver was really on it. It was, you could see their eyes going like mirror, mirror ahead, mirror, where are the kids? I just thought this was textbook on how to board kids safely in in an intersection or a pickup point that's not very ideal. So, these are the stories that never get reported. I just thought, good on you guys for doing it right. So there's a little positive opener. Um, so I have one more thing to do in way of an introduction. That is to introduce our special guest today. Travis Lauer is an investigator in the Motor Carrier Enforcement Division or Department or Office of the Wisconsin State Patrol, and we really appreciate Travis taking time to join us and educating us. Today's topic is drivers, like school bus drivers, drug and alcohol testing requirements. A good thing to know about. And as you probably know, Travis, um, about well, it's kind of vacillates, but about roughly half of our school districts, a little under half, have self-operated, their bus
hmm
fleets, and the other half, of course, are contracting out with Right Way and First Student and whomever. So with that introduction, I'll ask you how you doing this afternoon, I guess I should say.
Doing real well.
All
Doing
right, you
well.
ready to take over the slideshow and have at it?
Ready as I'll ever be, I guess. This is
All
the
right.
first webinar I've done, so we'll see how it goes.
Oh, it's going to be great.
So, yep, just bear with me here.
Yeah, absolutely. See, this
So
is
we'll
where
get
we can.
started with the topic today. Like Mike said, it's controlled substance and alcohol testing. It's something that hopefully everyone's familiar with, and hopefully nobody's learning about this for the first time. But if you are, feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll stop at any point for when we're going through any of these topics and get your questions answered. And if it's something that I can't answer right away, I will try to get the answer to you relatively soon. So we'll get started here and hopefully everyone can see my presentation.
So far, so good.
All right.
So Caitlin's with us. everyone on this call probably knows Caitlin monitors the chat. So if something is asked in the chat, Travis, don't be surprised to hear Caitlin pop in.
That sounds great. Thank you, Caitlin. All right, so what is the purpose of Part 382 under the Federal Motor Carrier Regulations? The basic purpose of this regulation is to establish programs designed to help prevent accidents and injuries resulting from the misuse of alcohol or the misuse of controlled substances by drivers in commercial motor vehicles. When did the program begin? Roughly 1989 is when drug and alcohol testing started for commercial motor vehicle drivers. Alcohol testing started in 1996, and 49 CFR 382.115 requires the implementation of these programs before you put your trucks on the road. So before you start any school bus operations, your drivers, you must have a program in place for your drivers to be drug and alcohol tested. So employees in transportation who operate commercial motor vehicles requiring a commercial driver's license greater than 26,000 pounds. So that's who this applies to for the most part. If it's under 26,000 pounds, it's a non-CDL vehicle. Those drivers do not need to be drug and alcohol tested, and they should not be in the same pool with your drivers that are in the drug and alcohol testing program. So you can still test those drivers, but they should not be in that same pool. We'll kind of go over that stuff as we go along here. But I just kind of wanted to point that out right away. That's a pretty important point, and a lot of things, one thing that gets overlooked quite a bit. The exemptions for drug and alcohol testing would be active military, operators of farm vehicles, or a covered farm vehicle. So some of the definitions that we're going to go through today are your safety sensitive employees in transportation who operate commercial motor vehicles requiring a CDL license. So the definition of a safety sensitive function is all the time from the time a driver begins work in readiness for work until the time he or she is relieved of all their responsibilities. So safety sensitive functions shall include all time spent at the employer or shipper while waiting to be dispatched, inspecting or servicing a CMV equipment. So that would be similar for a school bus driver doing their pre-trip or post-trip inspection. Upon driving any CMV except when time spent resting in a sleeper berth, well, that's not really going to apply to us in today. And anytime repairing or remaining in attendance upon a disabled vehicle. So all of those times are considered safety sensitive functions. Prohibitions. So no driver shall report for on duty or perform a safety sensitive function. Again, we talking about those things we just discussed
Mhm.
while having an alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater in a commercial motor vehicle. So no driver shall use alcohol while on duty or performing a safety sensitive function. No driver shall perform a safety sensitive function within 4 hours of using alcohol. So
Mhm.
basically, they cannot operate at all within 4 hours or have any alcohol within 4 hours of any safety sensitive function. And no driver shall refuse to submit to any required test within 382, 301, 382, 307. So when we talk about those regulations, we're talking about your pre-employment test, your post-accident test, your random controlled substance or alcohol test, or a reasonable suspicion test. And we'll cover a return to duty test as well, but we'll cover those things as we go through here through the slides. And no employer shall permit a driver who refuses to submit to such tests to perform safety sensitive functions. So what that basically means, if a driver refuses a test, that's the same as a positive test when it comes to the FMCSA's regulations. So prohibitions continued. No driver shall report for duty or remain on duty when a driver uses any controlled substance except under a doctor's orders. So there are certain things that you are allowed to operate, and doctors will prescribe those, and those are the ones that will be allowed. Or when a driver has been advised by a doctor in writing that the substance will not adversely affect his or her ability to safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. So the types of tests that we take a look at are your pre-employment tests. So before any driver can be hired and put on the road, the driver must have a pre-employment controlled substance test. Your post-accident test, so that is both alcohol and controlled substance. A random test, so that is both alcohol or controlled substance. So all of your drivers, your CDL drivers, should be in a random testing pool, and they get tested at a certain rate for each year. So the rate currently that the FMCSA is regulating is 10% of the drivers in your pool must be tested for alcohol, and 50% of the drivers in your controlled substance pool must be tested for controlled substances. Reasonable suspicion tests could be alcohol or controlled substance, as can return to duty or follow-up tests when required. So a follow-up test would be a test that's required after a driver has tested positive, and now they are getting tested randomly or for follow-up just to make sure they're continuing with their treatment and not abusing any controlled substance or alcohol.
Hey Travis, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give you a break there for a second, right?
Yeah.
The types of tests that are listed here, I was just curious. This goes beyond statutory, so I'm just asking for your background knowledge. Are these can these be performed by the employer, or are they typically like farmed out to like a third party testing entity? Or what's the current practice on this?
So these would all be performed typically by a medical facility. So your hospitals will perform these types of tests, or certain labs will perform them as well.
Ah, very good. Thank you.
Yep. So pre-employment testing, we're going to kind of go into each one of these different tests. Like I said before, it's prior to performing any safety sensitive function for an employer. The driver shall undergo a test for controlled substances. So obviously, alcohol is pretty short term. We don't do pre-employment testing for alcohol just because it's a short-lived substance, where drug testing is more of a long-term thing, and you'll actually be able to detect that prior to a person drives for a company. A verified negative test is required from the MRO, which is the medical review officer. It's usually a doctor that reviews all the tests prior to performing any safety sensitive function. And an employer is not required to administer a pre-employment alcohol test. And we kind of talked about why that already is. Another test that we is required is a post-accident test. So if a driver is involved in a reportable crash, they must undergo an alcohol and controlled substance test when the accident involves a loss of human life. So whenever there's a fatality in a crash, you must undergo post-accident testing. If there's a citation under state or local law that was issued within 8 hours for a moving violation arising from the accident, and so that's the important part here is a citation was issued and someone was injured, and one of the vehicles was towed from the scene. So those are the circumstances when a post-accident test would be required. And when we talk about post-accident tests, just like the slide showed earlier, that is both an alcohol test and a controlled substance test. So again, loss of human life and a citation issued within 8 hours to the driver for a moving violation, and there is an injury to anyone involved, or there is disabling damage where a vehicle is towed from the scene. So as far as when these tests should be conducted for post-accident testing, for alcohol, that should be done as soon as practicable. If the test is not administered within 2 hours following the accident, the company shall prepare and maintain a record stating the reason the test was not administered. And if it's not administered within 8 hours, the employer shall cease all attempts to administer an alcohol test. So basically, um, once you have an accident and you find out it meets the criteria that we talked about, you should be sending that driver to a test as soon as possible and minimally within 8 hours. If you cannot do that within 8 hours or even within 2 hours, you have to have a reason as to why you could not do that. And after 8 hours, you shall cease all attempts to do an alcohol test. And then records shall be submitted to the FMCSA or the State Patrol upon request. So when we come in and do an audit, that's what my work unit does, or the FMCSA would do. We would actually come in and do an audit on a carrier or a school district that's operating commercial motor vehicles. We would ask for these records, and you have to be able to produce either the reason or the test themselves.
Makes sense.
So the controlled substance testing should be conducted again as soon as possible and minimally within 32 hours. Okay. And then similar to before with like the alcohol test, if you can't get it done within 32 hours, you are to cease all attempts to do the testing. And just like before, if you are unable to do the test, you have to have a written reason as to why you were unable to conduct that test. And basically, a driver who is subject to post-accident testing shall remain readily available for such testing or may be deemed by the employer to have refused to submit a test. So if the driver leaves the scene, goes somewhere else, and doesn't answer your calls to get the test, that is considered a refusal, which is, like we talked before, a refusal is similar to a positive test. It'll be treated like that.
Right.
So post-accident testing. So a motor carrier may accept the results of a breath test for alcohol or a urine test for drugs from law enforcement, provided the test conforms to 49 CFR Part 40. So basically, it has to test for the same drugs that the 5 panels of drugs that the DOT tests for, the FMCSA. So the test has to have marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCP. It has to test for those drugs. So, and just like the slide says, make sure if you can't assume that what they're testing for is going to meet all of those requirements. So if you are going to use the law enforcement test, make sure it does meet all the requirements of the FMCSA.
Interesting.
So random testing. So every driver is required to submit to random alcohol and controlled substance testing. Like we talked before, the drivers that are in your random controlled substance and alcohol testing pools will be tested at a 10% rate for alcohol and a 50% rate for controlled substances. The selection of drivers for random and controlled substance testing shall be done by a scientific method, such as a random number table or a computer-based random number generator. So it has to be some kind of a scientific method. It can't be drawing the names out of a hat. So you can't simply do that.
Hey, Travis, I'm assuming these are minimums, meaning an employer who's particularly vigilant about this might potentially have percentages that are higher if they wish to, 20% or 30%.
Absolutely. So, in a lot of times when we talk about the consortium that a company will be participate in, so a lot of times, if a school district or a motor carrier only has 10 drivers, they're not going to have their own random drug testing pool because those drivers if they're getting tested at the 10 and 50% level and they're getting tested quarterly, you're going to have the same drivers get picked over and over again. So what normally happens is your company will enroll in a larger pool with other companies. So your major health networks will have a drug and alcohol consortium, and they will enroll companies from all over the state. So you'll have hundreds, if not, 1,000 drivers in this testing pool, and then they will pick their from there. So if you're in one of those larger pools like that, there may be times where none of your drivers get selected, or there may be times where your drivers are selected. There's some guys that get picked all the time, and I always tell those guys they should go buy a lottery ticket because they're winning the lottery all the time when they get picked multiple times.
Oh, that's
So
really, really helpful information. I was thinking of all these, the what is it, the median sized school district in Wisconsin is just 870 something kids. That's the median. We have a lot that are smaller than that. And so you may have just a couple of bus drivers, maybe 3 or 4 bus drivers total. So that idea of pooling and a consortium that's new to me. I always learn something on these calls, so thank you.
yeah, no problem. So yeah, that's I would say that's the majority of the way most districts do things. I don't know of many places that do their own controlled substance testing pool. So
Yeah.
so random testing continued. Basically, under the selection process used, each driver shall have an equal chance of being tested each time the selections are made. So um, when we talk about this, this is where we make sure that we don't have any drivers, and you make sure your driver counts and your driver list for the drivers that are actually in the pool is current all the time. So usually what happens is a consortium will test quarterly for drug and alcohol testing. And before each quarter, they will send you a list and say, hey, um, carrier, this is the list of drivers that you currently have for us. Is this list current? And those are the times where you have to let the consortium know that nope, this driver left, or we gained these drivers. And once they have a good list, then they will actually pick the drivers from there who are going to be tested. So it's pretty important to keep those tests current. And that's where it's also important not to have any drivers in the pool that are not CDL drivers, because basically what they call that is it's called polluting the pool. Because if you have drivers that have been fired, their names are in the pool, or if they're drivers that are missing from the pool, or there are non-CDL drivers in the pool, basically you're taking the chance away from a current driver to get picked when the selections happen.
Right.
So if the employer conducts random testing through a pool, the individual number of drivers to be tested may be calculated for each individual employer, or maybe based on the total number of drivers covered in the consortium. So that's basically talking about that larger pool. So if a company is in a larger pool with multiple companies, that's the numbers that we use for the 10 and 50%. We use that total number for not just the company's numbers. So random testing, the employer must ensure that the tests are unannounced, and that the dates are spread reasonably throughout the calendar year. So um, sometimes there are companies that actually will come and do testing for the carrier, and say like a mobile testing van will show up and test the drivers. It's best to make sure that you kind of keep that out of sight, and so that the drivers, you know, I've heard a story before, basically where uh, the mobile testing site would show up at the beginning of the shift, and everyone, as they were approaching the school, driving up to the location, or wherever it was, could see that the testing truck was there for the day. And that's where you would have certain people turn around and then call in sick for the day before they got to the testing site. So you
Oh.
you want to make sure it's completely unannounced. Now, like I said, that what I'm talking about, it's not that was not a school district, so that's a good thing. So,
That's so classic, though. Right. Okay.
but yeah, it's human nature. But yeah, you want to make sure that those tests are definitely unannounced. And as far as spread out throughout the year, um, you want to make sure that if you have a driver that is unable to test that's been selected, that you actually get a replacement driver to select them for that certain period so that you're not making up a bunch of tests at the end of the year. You want to make sure it's evenly done.
I have a similar anecdote. It's from police and fire. It's a municipal situation. It's kind of like the unannounced requirement in that the employer always did testing like the first week of October, like every year, and the employees kind of figured it out. So
Yep.
you really got to mix it up.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And so usually what happens is the consortium will give you a list each quarter, and then it's up to the carrier then to decide within that quarter when to announce that those tests are to be done within that quarter. So if it's within a 3 month period, you might decide that you're going to tell this person a month into the that quarter.
So we did have a quick question in the chat. Uh,
Okay.
is there a certain number of hours that you should aim for prior to announcing the test, or should you just not announce it at all? How should they go about that?
So normally you're going to tell your individual drivers that have been selected. You're not going to tell everyone. You're only going to tell the people that have been selected. And like I said, you have that full quarter to test that person. So you can decide to do it as long as it's done within that quarter. You can do that at any time. It doesn't have to be right away when you're notified. It just needs to be done with, like I said, within that quarter time period.
Thank you.
Mhm. And basically, the employer shall require that each driver is notified of the selection to be tested, proceed to the site immediately. So once you tell a driver that they are supposed to go get tested, they're supposed to go right away. Okay, even if they're off duty. So the only time you can actually test off duty is when a driver is for controlled substances. You can't test off duty for alcohol. When a driver is performing safety sensitive functions at the time of notification, the employer shall instead ensure the driver ceases to perform that function and proceeds to the testing site. So right before work or right after work, you can do it that way. So once they're done with their route, if you want to notify them at that time that they need to go get tested, that would be a good time to do it for an alcohol test. Like I said, for a controlled substance test, you can actually notify them off duty that they need to go get tested.
So, little follow-up to the previous question.
Mhm.
So, what's like the maximum amount of time in between like when you notify a driver and when they have to be at that test site?
So it says immediately. So if you know where the driver is and you know where the testing site is, you should be able to figure out a good amount of time that is reasonable for the driver to get there. So, I mean, things happen, that might delay them. But if it's a reasonable excuse for why they were delayed, I wouldn't say that that's something that shouldn't be allowed. Like I said, it needs to be reasonable. So use your best judgment.
Sure.
And kind of along that same lines, what if you have a driver who is selected to be tested, but they work a second job, it's the end of their shift, and they can't go immediately? How should you deal with that?
Hmm.
So if so that's when you have to select the best time to test that person. So if you know that person has a second job and they can't go, that would be the driver that you don't pick. to go at those times. That would be the driver where, okay, well, maybe he's got a route that day, and you select them before the route starts, and you tell that person, okay, we know we've picked him for the testing. What we're going to do is we're going to pull him from his route. We're going to do a substitute for his route that day. And instead of going on his route, he's going to go get tested. So you could do something like that, so it doesn't interfere with what other things that he may have going on.
Awesome.
You
Thank
know,
you.
I think I think Travis is exactly right. Yeah, some of this falls on the employer to be reasonable and to anticipate some of these problems. And I mean, this is really high stakes if you're the employee. You must do this testing, and if you don't, you're likely to lose your job or at least not be able to perform these essential functions. And so if that's kind of on the employee side of the equation, then I think it falls on the employer side to be aware of reasonable scheduling and avoid the kinds of no-win situations like the question was describing. So yeah, I mean it's on the employer to do this well too. I guess is my point. So
Yeah, I mean, the FMCSA is pretty clear on how the tests are to be conducted. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there. It's on the employer to make sure that the testing is done correctly.
exactly.
Um, One note I would make is, make sure that you actually get a response from the employee when you send them the test. So if you send them a text message, don't just expect that they're going to read it later on, and make sure that, and so it's best actually to talk to that person so that they know they're supposed to go get tested. We've had circumstances before where carriers will send a text message or you know tell someone else to tell that person that they need to go get tested. So make sure that it's going to be one person that does the selection process for the employer. Make sure that person is the one that always is the one telling the employees that they need to go, and make sure that they actually get a response from the employee that they are going to go. So a driver shall only be tested for alcohol when the driver is performing a safety sensitive function, just before or after they've performed the safety sensitive function, or just after they've ceased performing that safety sensitive function. So a little bit different than a controlled substance. Controlled substances can be done when they're off duty. Reasonable suspicion testing. So this is testing basically when you have identified an employee that has come to work and is possibly under the influence of controlled substance or alcohol. So an employer shall require a driver to submit to a controlled substance or alcohol test when the employer has reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver is in violation. The employer's determination must be based on specific current observations that can be expressed in clear, explicit language about the driver's appearance, behavior, speech, or body odors. So if you smell alcohol on the driver, or you see bloodshot eyes or slurred speech type of behavior, all of those things that we know that comes with being under the influence of controlled substance or alcohol, those are the times you're actually going to send that person for a reasonable suspicion test. And there actually is a requirement for training. So certain supervisors should be sent for training for reasonable suspicion training. And they go, and it's an hour-long class for both the controlled substance and an hour-long class for the alcohol training.
Good idea.
So controlled substances for the observations may include indications that the chronic withdrawal effects for controlled substances. A supervisor or company official must make the required observations and be trained in accordance with 382-603. And that's what we just spoke about, that hour-long class for the controlled substance and alcohol. The person who makes the determination that reasonable suspicion exists shall not conduct the test of the driver. So the employer will never be the one doing the actual test. You'll be sending that person to a place to be tested. If an alcohol test is required by this section, it is not administered within 2 hours. The employer shall prepare and maintain a file record stating the reason that the test was not properly administered. So similar to the post-accident test, if you can't get a test done within the 2 hours, you must write down a reason or record a reason as to why that was not completed. And if it's not within 8 hours, similar to the post-accident test, then you shall cease all possible tests for alcohol. What do we do for positive test results? So if you have a positive test result, the first thing you're going to do is immediately remove the driver from all safety sensitive functions. That's the most important thing. So whether that's on the side of the road or at any point, as soon as you find out that there is a positive test result, no matter where they are, even if they're in the middle of a route, if you get indication or notification from a consortium, the MRO has verified that there is a positive test result, contact that driver and tell them to stop and get another driver on the route if necessary. But, there really is once you are notified, all of the liability now rests on you to get that stuff completed. Once there's a positive test, you must refer the driver to a controlled substance abuse professional, which is what we call an SAP, for evaluation as soon as possible. And the driver must comply with the SAP's recommendations for treatment prior to the driver returning to the safety sensitive function. Okay. So you can refer, basically by FMCSA rules, you are required to refer them to an SAP. You are not required to keep them employed. Okay. So if you get a positive test, you are allowed to terminate the driver, but you still must refer them to a substance abuse professional. If a determination that a driver is in need of assistance in resolving problems associated with alcohol or the misuse of controlled substances, each employer shall ensure that the driver is subject to unannounced follow-up testing as directed by the SAP. So there will be tests that are required after the driver goes through their evaluation, and the SAP will determine what those tests and when those tests actually occur. So positive test results continued. Each employer shall ensure that before a driver returns to a duty requiring the performance of a safety sensitive function, for alcohol, the driver shall undergo a return to duty alcohol test, and with a result indicating an alcohol concentration of less than 0.02. And for controlled substance, the driver must undergo a return to duty controlled substance test with the result indicating a negative test. All drug test results are reviewed and interpreted by the medical review officer, the MRO, before they are reported to the employer. If the laboratory reports a positive result to the MRO contacts the driver in person by telephone and conducts an interview to determine if there is an alternative medication explanation for the drugs found in the driver's urine specimen. So they're going to double check with the driver to make sure that they aren't prescribed any medication that would cause the positive result. If the driver provides appropriate documentation and the MRO determines that it is legitimate medical use of the prohibited drug, the drug test result is reported as a negative to the employer. So that's all going to happen before they get reported to you. Retention of records. So when we talk about the retention of records, each employer shall maintain records of its alcohol misuse and controlled substances use prevention programs as follows. So The records shall be maintained in a secure location. So should be a location that's not accessible to the employees. It has to be something that's basically only accessible to the person that's in charge of your program. A lot of times now records are in a digital format, so you don't have to worry about that as much. If you're in part of a larger consortium, a lot of times the consortium will actually have a portal where you're actually able to log into their portal with a secured account and review their records directly from them. And that's a allowable reason or location for your records. There is no requirement to maintain physical records on site. Records which shall be retained for 5 years. So all of these records, if you have any of these, they must be maintained for 5 years. So any records of positive tests, so a positive alcohol test of alcohol concentration above 0.02 or greater, or a positive controlled substance test. Documentation of a refusal, just like we talked before, refusals are the same as a positive test. Driver evaluations and referrals, calibration documentation. That's more likely going to be kept by your consortium themselves because they're going to be the ones calibrating their testing instruments. Records related to the administration of alcohol-controlled substance testing programs. Again, that's going to be your consortium that maintains their records on how they're actually doing their testing. And a copy of each annual calendar year summary required by 382-403. So that is your calendar summary showing that you have met the 10 and 50% requirements for alcohol and drug testing. Records to be retained for 2 years. So records related to the alcohol and controlled substance testing process, except calibration and evidential breath testing devices. So your records regarding your selection periods and your selection process, so that all of that stuff should be kept for 2 years. Your quarterly draw requests from your consortium, all of those things should be kept for 2 years. And negative test results will be kept for 1 year, and canceled controlled substance tests should be kept for 1 year. Anything less than 0.02 for an alcohol test shall also be maintained for a minimum of 1 year. So location of records. So all records shall be maintained as required by 390-31. Basically, it says all records and documents maintained for the specific periods that we identified earlier. Make sure that the copies are legible and accurately reflect the information required to be contained in the records themselves. And the records shall be made available for inspection at the employer's principal place of business. Again, like I kind of said before, if you are part of a larger consortium and you have a portal that you actually log into on your computer to obtain their records, that is fine. That's a reasonable place to keep those records. And actually something that I would actually recommend, because usually the records are, you don't have problems with copies and usually everything's legible if it's coming off of a digital copy itself. Annual testing summary. So we talked about that annual testing summary to make sure that show that you're testing at that 50 and 10% rate. The employer shall prepare and maintain a summary of the results of its testing program when requested by the Secretary of Transportation. And when we talk about the Secretary of Transportation, that's the federal secretary. Any DOT agency or any state or local official with regulatory authority over the employer or any of its drivers. And that is the MIS report, which is the Management Information System. That's what MIS stands for. And basically it breaks down the tests that were completed by the carrier, and allows us to calculate the percentages. Inquiries to previous employers. So when you hire a driver, you used to have to actually contact their previous employers and find out about testing. That's no longer a requirement because of the drug and alcohol clearinghouse that is now in place. So just like I said before, an employer may not permit a driver to perform a safety sensitive function after 14 days without having made a good faith effort to obtain this information. So this is no longer in effect. So as of January 6, 2023, employers must use the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse with respect to FMCSA regulated employers. So the only exception to that is if a driver tested positive at some point, went through a SAP program where the substance abuse professional prescribed follow-up tests, you must contact the previous employer and get that follow-up testing plan from them or the SAP to make sure that you are doing the testing that is needed for that driver. All regulated carriers must have a drug and alcohol testing policy. So you must put in place a drug and alcohol testing policy for alcohol and controlled substances. And you must provide educational materials that explains the requirements and the employer's policies and procedures with respect to meeting the requirements. So you must basically provide each driver with information on your testing program and on the prohibitions for uses of alcohol and controlled substances. When it comes to, there are 12 points that must be actually covered in that policy. And the 12 points are basically you must identify the designated employer or the employer representative who is in charge of the drug and alcohol program for that carrier. You must identify the categories of drivers that are actually going to be tested. You must define safety sensitive functions to the driver so they know when they are regulated. You must discuss prohibited conduct and the circumstances for testing. You must discuss the procedures for testing and the requirements to submit to a test. Explain what constitutes a refusal and the consequences of controlled substance provisions and the consequences for the violation of controlled substance and alcohol use. You must also inform them that all info collected will be reported to the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So you will make sure that you have a copy of these materials that is distributed to each of the drivers, and that each of the drivers signs and certifies that they have kept a copy of that and on file and that they understand everything that they've read. So the employer shall maintain the original certificate that's been signed by the driver. How do you do? Supervisor reasonable suspicion training. So we talked about the reasonable suspicion test. This is the reasonable suspicion training that's required. It's 60 minutes of training for both alcohol and 60 minutes for controlled substance use. And again, it's basically to instruct the employer who is responsible for usually seeing drivers before or after a route and make sure that their physical behavior, speech, or there are no other performance indicators that would indicate they're under the influence of a controlled substance or alcohol. The Drug and Alcohol Testing Clearinghouse is a database of positive or alcohol test results and refusals. Drivers that have completed a return to duty test process and follow-up testing plan, there's also a database of that. And carriers are required to register and check for all entries on all prospective employees per 391.23. Drivers must register to grant employers access to the records in the database. So basically, when you hire a driver, you're going to have them sign up or make sure that they are signed up in the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and you're going to get their consent for you yourself to do a query on that driver in the clearinghouse to make sure there aren't any prohibitions for that driver currently in the database. So if there was a positive test for that driver, make sure that they had a return to duty test and make sure they are currently able to drive for you. There are two different types of queries that are done in the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. The annual query is a limited query, which just tells the carrier if there's information in the DAC, Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, on that driver. If there is information on that driver, they would then have to run a full query. A full query is also a pre-employment query. The carrier must have permission from the driver to run that query, and a limited query only requires written permission. So the full query actually requires permission that's actually registered in the clearinghouse. So additional state considerations. So we just went through all the federal rules when it comes to drug and alcohol testing. When we talk about in-state requirements for under Wisconsin Transportation Rule 300, Transportation Rule 316, 4 through 6, driver requirements. So it basically states a driver may not operate a school bus while under the influence of alcohol or a controlled substance, or a combination of alcohol and controlled substance, or permit the use of alcohol or controlled substance on any school bus. So basically, if it meets the definition of a school bus, whether it's a CDL required school bus or a smaller school bus, you cannot use alcohol or controlled substances on any school bus. Drivers operating a school bus that meets the definition of a commercial motor vehicle shall comply with 346-63.5 and 63.7A. So basically, 63.5 reduces the the prohibited alcohol concentration, and 63.7 will place a driver out of service for operating a commercial motor vehicle under the influence. Drivers operating a school bus must not meeting the definition of a commercial motor vehicle shall comply with the following rules. So similar to a commercial motor vehicle, they cannot operate within 4 hours of going on duty after having consumed alcohol or being under the influence of an intoxicating substance. The driver may not consume any intoxicating beverage regardless of its alcohol content while on duty or operating in physical control of a school bus. And the driver may not have in the driver's possession any alcohol beverage regardless of its alcohol content while on duty or operating a school bus. So that's basically to pull all of those non-CDL school buses under the same rules as a commercial motor vehicle school bus. So absolute sobriety for school buses. A driver may not operate a school bus while having any measured alcohol concentration above 0.00. And if you have questions, I can certainly answer those now. And if you have anything else, there's always this phone number you can contact.
Awesome. I don't see anything in the chat. You did a great job of answering questions along the way. I did have one person, when you are saying like you determine the time that the test is administered, administered, woof,
Mhm.
that means the district or the bus company is the one scheduling those tests or saying you need to go to the testing center.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Uh,
So basically what happens is a consortium will give you at the beginning of each quarter. So January, February, March, there's your first quarter. So say the first quarter that the consortium will say X number, these three drivers are going to have to go get tested in this quarter. That's all they're going to tell you is in that quarter. So within the next 3 months, it's then up to the school district to decide when the driver goes to get tested.
Excellent. Well, it looks like there are no questions in the chat. So again, really want to thank you for being here today, Travis. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. And if you wouldn't mind sending me your slides, I noted that you added some stuff since the last time we saw you.
Okay,
I'll get those posted along with the recording, probably early tomorrow. Um, and with that, that wraps up another edition of Transportation Tidbits.
great.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Travis, and we'll see y'all down the road.